In the year 1872, in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains near the fledgling town of Silverton, Colorado, where the earth rose sharp and unforgiving against a sky that swallowed men whole, Eliza trudged through the blizzard with her 3 children, clutched to her like shadows. The wind howled like a wounded beast, whipping snow into her face until her cheeks burned raw, each flake a needle pricking at the thin veil of her resolve. Her boots, worn thin from months on the trail, sank into drifts that pulled at her legs, demanding she surrender. Little Mary, barely 6, whimpered against her mother's skirt, her small hands frozen into fists. Behind them, 8-year-old Thomas carried 4-year-old Samuel on his back, the boy's head lolling with exhaustion, his breath coming in shallow puffs that fogged the air before vanishing. Eliza's arms ached from the weight of their meager bundle, a sack of hardened biscuits, and a frayed blanket that offered no warmth against the cold that seeped into her bones like regret. Her husband Jacob had promised a homestead in the valleys beyond, where the soil was rich and the rivers ran clear. But Jacob was gone now, taken by fever in a mining camp 2 months back, leaving her with nothing but debts and these children who looked at her with eyes too old for their faces. The indifference of the world pressed down the mountain. The mountains stood silent, their peaks cloaked in white, unmoved by her grief. She had sold their wagon for a pittance in Durango, trading it for supplies that had dwindled to dust. Now, miles from any road, the storm had erased the path, turning the landscape into a vast empty maw. Her throat tightened as she remembered Jacob's last words, whispered in the dim light of their tent. "Keep going west, Liza. The land will provide." But the land provided nothing but this endless white torment. Mary's cough rattled through the wind, a small hacking sound that twisted Eliza's gut. She paused, kneeling in the snow to pull the girl close, feeling the child's frail body shiver against her own. The cold clawed at her exposed neck, and she thought of her own mother back in Missouri, who had warned against following a dreamer like Jacob. "The frontier eats women like you," she'd said, her voice laced with the bitterness of her own lost youth. Eliza pushed the memory away, but it lingered like the frost on her lashes. They had been walking since dawn, or what passed for it in this gray haze. Thomas's steps faltered now, his shoulders slumping under Samuel's weight. "Mama," he murmured, his voice barely cutting through the gale. "I can't. My feet." Eliza turned, her heart fracturing at the sight of his reddened face, the tears frozen on his cheeks. She shifted Mary to her hip and reached for Samuel, the boy's limp form heavy in her arms. "Just a bit farther," she lied, her words tasting of ash. The truth was, she didn't know where farther led. The map Jacob had sketched was long lost, blown away in a previous storm, like so much of their hope. As the light faded, a shape emerged through the swirling white, a cabin squat and weathered, its logs darkened by years of harsh winters. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, a thin promise of warmth. Eliza's pulse quickened, a spark of desperation igniting in her chest. She staggered toward it, the children trailing like ghosts. At the door, rough-hewn and solid, she raised a numb hand and knocked the sound dull against the roar of the wind. No answer. She knocked again, harder, her knuckles splitting against the wood. Inside, she imagined emptiness, or worse, hostility. But the children needed shelter, their lives hung by this thread. The door creaked open, revealing a man broad as the mountains themselves, his beard thick and wild eyes narrowed against the intrusion. He wore a coat of patched hides, and the scent of wood smoke and solitude wafted out. He said nothing at first, just stared at the ragged woman and her brood, the blizzard framing them like a cruel portrait. Eliza's voice cracked as she spoke. "Please, sir, my children, they're hungry." The storm. He stepped aside without a word, the gesture small but immense, like a crack in the indifferent rock. Warmth spilled out, wrapping around them as they crossed the threshold. The cabin was sparse, a fire crackling in the hearth, a table scarred from use hides on the floor. He closed the door, shutting out the howl, and Eliza sank to her knees, pulling her children close. Thomas's eyes widened at the sight of a pot simmering on the fire, the aroma of stew cutting through the cold that clung to their clothes. Samuel stirred his small hand, reaching out. The man watched, his face unreadable, but in the flicker of the flames, something softened, a quiet yielding, perhaps to the weight of their need. Eliza's mind drifted back to the trail from Missouri, the wagon train where Jacob had courted her with stories of gold and open skies. She had been 19 then, full of foolish fire, leaving behind a life of drudgery on her parents' farm. But the journey had stripped them bare, cholera claiming friends, rivers, swallowing supplies, and Jacob's dreams crumbling under the reality of barren claims. Now, here in this stranger's refuge, the past pressed in heavy as the snow outside. She watched as the man ladled stew into bowls, his movements deliberate, scarred hands steady. Mary took a spoonful, her eyes closing in silent gratitude, and Eliza felt a tear trace her cheek, warm against the lingering chill. The man, Elias, he grunted by way of introduction, sat across from them, his silence a wall. But as the fire popped and the children ate, he glanced at Eliza, seeing perhaps the echo of his own losses in her weary frame. Outside the blizzard raged on, indifferent, but inside a fragile warmth took hold. If this tale felt earned through grit and silence, subscribe and stay for the cost of the next one. The fire snapped and hissed, sending sparks up the stone chimney like tiny stars fleeing the dark. Eliza sat on the edge of the bearskin rug, knees drawn up, watching her children. Mary had curled against Thomas's side, both asleep now, their breathing slow, and even for the first time in days. Samuel lay across her lap, small chest rising and falling under the weight of the wool blanket Elias had draped over him without ceremony. The stew had warmed them from the inside. Color had crept back into their cheeks. Yet Eliza could not close her eyes. Every creak of the cabin timbers made her flinch, as though the storm outside might still reach in and take what little remained. Elias moved quietly about the room. He banked the fire, added another split log, then sat on the far side of the hearth on a three-legged stool that looked carved by his own hand. The distance between them felt deliberate, respectful. He did not ask questions. That silence was a kindness she had not expected. Most men on the frontier demanded answers the moment a stranger crossed their threshold. Who are you? Where's your man? What do you want? As though possession and purpose were the only currency that mattered. She stole glances at him. His hands, broad and scarred, rested on his knees. One knuckle was crooked-heeled wrong, long ago. A thin white line ran from the corner of his left eye into the beard, old enough that the hair grew sparse along it. He smelled faintly of pine sap and cured leather, of a life spent alone with the high country. Yet there was no menace in the way he sat, only a stillness that reminded her of the elk she had once watched from a ridge, watchful, patient, ready to vanish if the wind shifted wrong. After a long while he spoke, voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. You come far from the San Juan claims, she answered. Durango before that. Missouri before Missouri stopped mattering. He nodded once, the motion small. Jacob Harrow, your man. The name struck her like a cold slap. She looked up sharply. You knew him, seen him. Poker table in Rico last fall. Talked big about a vein that would make him rich. Left owing 3 men more than he carried. Elias's gaze stayed on the flames. Didn't make it through the winter. Word was. Eliza's throat closed. She had known, of course, had held his hand while the fever burned him out, but hearing it spoken plainly in this stranger's mouth made the loss fresh again, sharp as broken glass. She pressed her lips together until they hurt. He meant to come back for us, she said, the words sounding thin even to her own ears. Elias made a sound that might have been agreement or pity. She could not tell. Men mean a lot of things. She looked down at Samuel's sleeping face, at the faint bruise of exhaustion under his eyes. They're all I have left. Another silence stretched, filled only by the wind clawing at the shutters. Then Elias rose slow and deliberate, crossed to a wooden chest against the wall. He lifted the lid and drew out a small burlap sack, heavier than it looked. When he set it beside her, dried apples, and a half loaf of journey bread spilled onto the rug. Next came a tin of condensed milk, precious as gold in these parts. Was saving it, he said simply. For spring, maybe. They can have it now. Eliza stared at the food, then at him. Something cracked inside her chest, not grief this time, but the beginning of something warmer, more dangerous. Gratitude. She had learned long ago that gratitude could be a chain heavier than iron. I can't repay you, she whispered. Didn't ask you to. She swallowed. We'll be gone soon as the storm breaks. He studied her a moment, then looked toward the small window where snow pressed against the glass like a white tide. Storm's got 3 days in it yet. Maybe 4. You ain't going anywhere. The words landed soft, but they carried weight. Not a command. A fact. And beneath the fact, an offer she was too tired, too broken to refuse. That night she slept on the rug beside her children, wrapped in one of Elias's heavy coats that smelled of wood smoke and solitude. She dreamed of Missouri, of green fields and her mother's kitchen, of a life that had never really been hers. When she woke, gray light seeped through the cracks in the shutters. The blizzard still raged, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady. Elias was already up, coat on, axe in hand. He paused at the door. Need more wood, he said. Stay put. She nodded, throat too tight for words. He was gone most of the morning. When he returned, snow caked his shoulders, breath steaming. He carried not only split pine, but a small dead hare frozen stiff. He skinned it in the lean-to movements practiced and unhurried, then set the meat to soak in a kettle. Later, he taught Thomas how to sharpen the skinning knife on an oiled stone patient when the boy's hands shook from cold and inexperience. Mary watched from the doorway, clutching the rag doll she had carried all the way from Missouri, its stitched face half gone. Eliza worked beside him when she could, kneading journey bread from the last of his flour, boiling snow for water, mending a tear in Samuel's coat with sinew and a bone needle he handed her without comment. Each small task felt like stitching herself back together piece by ragged piece. Days blurred. The storm held. They ate simply, spoke little, yet the silence between them grew companionable. She learned he had come west after the war, after a wife and infant daughter died of diphtheria in Ohio while he was still marching through Georgia. He never said their names. He didn't need to. The absence lived in the way he paused, sometimes staring at nothing, axe handle gripped too tight. One evening after the children slept, she found him sitting outside on the chopping block, despite the wind staring at the black bulk of the peaks. She wrapped herself in his spare coat and stepped out, the cold biting her face. You don't have to stay out here, she said. Like the quiet. She stood beside him, shoulder almost touching his. Quiet can be loud sometimes. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah. After a moment, she spoke again, softer. I'm obliged, Elias, more than I can say. He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. In the faint starlight, his face looked carved from the same granite as the mountains. Don't owe me your thanks. Just keep those kids breathing. She felt the words settle deep like stones in a riverbed. Not romance, not yet, but something sturdier. Recognition. 2 people who had both been hollowed out and were still standing. The next morning, the wind dropped. Snow still fell, but softer, almost gentle. Elias went to check the trail. When he returned, his face was grim. Slide took out the lower pass, he said. We're cut off till melt. Eliza felt the cabin shrink around her. Trapped. Yet the fear that should have come did not arrive. Instead, she looked at her children playing quietly with bits of kindling Elias had whittled into animals at the man who had opened his door and his stores without asking for anything in return, and something inside her shifted. She was not safe, not yet, but she was no longer alone. The days lengthened toward a fragile truce with the weather. The snow fell lighter now, more drift than storm, and the sun appeared for brief blinding moments, turning the world to blinding white. Elias took to leaving the cabin before first light, checking traps along the frozen creek, hauling back what the high country would spare: a lean marten, a pair of snowshoe hares, once a small buck whose antlers he sawed off and hung above the door like quiet trophies. Each return he laid the meat on the table without flourish, then went to work skinning and quartering in the lean-to while Eliza kept the fire fed and the children occupied. Thomas followed him like a shadow now. At first, Elias said little, only corrected the boy's grip on the knife or showed him how to read a track half buried in fresh powder. But one afternoon, while they scraped hides together near the hearth, Elias spoke of the war. Not the battles, not the blood, but the long silences between. How the quiet after cannon fire was worse than the noise. How he had walked home to an empty house, the diphtheria already finished with what he loved. Thomas listened without interrupting, small hands steady on the stretching frame. When Elias fell silent again, the boy simply nodded once, as though some understanding had passed between them, wordless. Mary took to helping Eliza with the simpler tasks, grinding dried corn with a stone mortar. Elias kept folding the blankets each morning with careful precision. She no longer cried for her father in the night. Instead, she asked questions, soft ones, almost whispered, about the mountains, about the animals that lived higher than men could climb. Eliza answered what she could, surprised by how much she remembered from Jacob's stories, how the telling of them no longer cut quite so deep. Samuel grew stronger fastest. The condensed milk and hair broth worked their slow miracle. He toddled after Elias, now clutching the hem of the big man's coat, babbling half-words at the dogs. Elias kept chained near the woodpile, two rangy hounds that lifted their heads and thumped tails whenever the boy drew near. Elias never shooed him away. Once Eliza caught him lifting Samuel onto his shoulders so the child could touch the lowest antlers above the door, the boy's laughter bright against the dull roar of wind in the pines. One evening after supper, Elias sat cleaning his rifle by lamplight while Eliza darned a sock. The children slept in the narrow bunk he had built against the far wall, three small bodies tangled under the same heavy quilt. The cabin felt smaller, now warmer, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and slow-cooked meat. "Do you ever think of going back?" Elias asked, not looking up from the oiled cloth moving along the barrel. Eliza paused, needle hovering. "Missouri, anywhere that ain't this high and this hard." She considered the question longer than she meant to. The memory of green fields rose unbidden, her mother's porch laundry snapping on the lined church bells on Sunday. A life measured in seasons instead of survival. Yet the thought of returning felt like stepping backward into a grave already dug. "I thought about it," she admitted. "Every day on the trail after Jacob died. But the children, they've seen too much open sky now. They'd wither in a place that small." Elias gave a single nod. "Sky changes a person. Can't unsee it." She looked at him, then really looked. The lamplight caught the scar beside his eye, turned the gray in his beard to silver. He was not young, not old either. A man worn smooth by weather and grief, the way river stones lose their edges. Yet there was a steadiness in him she had not known she needed until it was there. "And you," she asked, quietly, "ever think of leaving?" He set the rifle across his knees. For a long moment he said nothing, then thought about it after they died. Figured I'd drink myself under in some saloon or let the next winter take me. But the mountains don't care if you stay or go. They just keep standing. So I stayed. The words hung between them, plain and heavy. Eliza felt something loosen inside her chest, a knot she had carried so long she forgot its shape. Not love, not the quick burning kind she had once felt for Jacob, but something slower, deeper, like roots finding purchase in thin soil. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his, just for a moment. His skin was rough, warm. He did not pull away. Neither of them spoke again that night. The fire settled to coals. Outside, a wolf called once, answered by another, their voices threading through the dark like silver wire. The next morning broke clear and bitter cold. Elias harnessed the two mules he kept in a lean-to stable and rode out to scout the pass. He returned before noon, wind-reddened expression, unreadable. Trails open, he said, stamping snow from his boots. Not easy, but a horse can make it. You could reach Silverton in 2 days if you push. Eliza stood at the table, hands buried in dough. The words landed like stones in still water. She looked at the children, Thomas sharpening a stick with the knife Elias had given him, Mary humming softly, while she sorted dried apples, Samuel asleep on the rug, with one of the hounds curled beside him like a guard. She met Elias's eyes. And if we don't push, he studied her a long beat. Then you stay till the melt. Help with the garden come spring. Trap what we can. Wait for the trails to dry. It was not a proposal of marriage. Not yet. But it was an offer of time of days strung together without the need to run. Eliza wiped flour from her hands. We'll stay, she said. The words came steady, certain. If you'll have us. Something flickered across his face, relief perhaps, or the beginning of hope. So long buried it felt strange in the light. He gave the smallest nod. Then we'll need more wood, he said, voice rough but softer than before. And the boy can help me set snares tomorrow. Outside the sun struck the snow and turned it to diamonds. Inside the cabin held its breath as though the mountains themselves were listening. The weeks turned into a quiet rhythm, measured not by calendars, but by the slow retreat of snow and the lengthening light. Mornings began with Elias and Thomas leaving before dawn, breath clouding in the sharp air, returning with firewood stacked high or small game slung over a shoulder. Eliza learned the cabin's secrets, where Elias kept the tin of coffee beans wrapped in oilcloth, how to coax the temperamental cookstove into steady flame the way the floorboards near the hearth gave a soft groan underfoot when the fire burned low. She mended what needed mending, Elias's coat torn along the seam from a barbed wire fence, years back the children's stockings worn through, at the heels and in the dewing felt pieces of herself, knit together again. One afternoon, while the sun hung pale and high, Elias took her to the small meadow behind the cabin. Snow still lay in patches, but beneath it the earth was waking. He knelt, brushed away the white crust, and showed her the first green spears of wild onion pushing through. Come May, he said, there'll be morels here and chokecherries higher up, enough to put by for winter. Eliza crouched beside him, fingers brushing the cold, resilient shoots. You've done this alone a long time. Long enough, the silence got comfortable. He glanced at her eyes steady. Ain't as comfortable now. The admission came plain without flourish, yet it landed deep. She felt heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from the sudden nearness of possibility. She had not let herself imagine staying, not truly, until the words were spoken aloud. Jacob's dreams had been loud, glittering things. Elias's were quieter, rooted in what the land could actually give. That evening, after the children were settled, Elias sat at the table cleaning his rifle again, the same deliberate motions she had come to recognize as thought made visible. Eliza poured the last of the coffee into 2 tin cups and set one before him. She remained standing. I need to tell you something, she said. He set the rifle aside, gave her his full attention. Jacob owed money in Rico. Not just gambling debt. He signed papers, promissory notes for supplies we never got. The man holding them is Harlan Crow. Runs the assay office and half the claims around Silverton. Word me. Elias's jaw tightened just a fraction. How much? $240. More with interest by now. He exhaled through his nose. Crow's not the forgiving kind. No. She wrapped her arms around herself. I thought if I kept moving west, stayed ahead of the word, it might fade. But debts like that don't fade. They follow. Elias looked into his coffee a long moment. Then you're not running anymore. The statement was simple, final. She met his gaze. I don't want to. Not if there's something worth standing still for. He rose, slowly crossed the small space between them. Not touching yet, close enough she could feel the warmth coming off him, smell the faint trace of pine and gun oil. Then we face it together. Crow wants his money, he'll have to come through me first. Eliza's throat worked. You don't owe me that. I'm not doing it because I owe you. His voice dropped lower. I'm doing it because I want you here. All of you. When the melt comes, when the trail dries, we go down to Silverton. We settle it clean. If he won't listen to reason, we find another way. She searched his face, looking for the hesitation she had seen in so many men before. There was none. Only the same quiet certainty he brought to splitting wood or reading a game trail. She lifted her hand, laid it against the side of his face. The beard was coarse under her palm, beneath it the skin warm alive. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, leaning into the touch, like a man long starved of kindness. When he opened them again, something had shifted, small, irrevocable. I ain't good with words, Eliza. Never was. But I've got steady hands and a roof that don't leak. If you'll have that, it's yours. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sorrow this time. We'll have it, she whispered. All of us. He bent his head, rested his forehead against hers. No kiss, not yet. Just the simple, profound meeting of two people who had both walked long roads alone, and now chose not to. Outside, the last of the day's light bled from the sky. A great horned owl called once from the ridge, low and resonant, answered by the soft sigh of wind through the pines. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting their joined shadows long across the rough plank floor. The next weeks passed in purposeful quiet. Elias repaired the harnesses, sharpened tools, checked the cache of furs he had stored in the lean to enough perhaps to trade for coin in Silverton. Eliza taught Mary to read the almanac. Elias kept on the shelf, its pages yellowed and dog-eared, while Thomas helped Elias build a small smokehouse behind the cabin. Samuel grew bolder, chasing the hounds until his laughter rang against the trees. Yet beneath the work ran a current of unease. Word traveled slowly in the high country, but it traveled. One morning, a rider appeared on the trail, thin-bearded, wearing the badge of a county deputy. He did not dismount, only called from the saddle. Harlan Crow sends regards to the Harrow widow. Says he expects payment by month's end. Says he knows where she's holed up. Elias stepped forward, rifle loose in the crook of his arm. Tell Crow if he wants his money, he can come collect it himself. We'll be down directly. The deputy spat into the snow. He'll be waiting. When the man was gone, Elias turned to Eliza. We leave at first light tomorrow. She nodded, heart steady, despite the fear that coiled beneath it. We leave together. That night, they sat by the fire, children asleep, the cabin wrapped in the deep hush that comes before hard choices. Elias reached into his pocket and drew out a small object wrapped in soft deathskin. He unfolded it carefully. A plain gold band, worn smooth by years. Was my wife's, he said. Kept it because letting go felt like forgetting. But I reckon it's time. He held it out. Eliza took it, felt the faint warmth still clinging to the metal. She slipped it onto the third finger of her left hand. It fit as though made for her. She lifted her eyes to his. When we come back from Silverton, she said, we'll speak the words proper, in front of whoever will witness. But this is enough for now. He took her hand, thumb brushing over the ring. It's more than enough. Outside, the stars burn cold and clear above the peaks. Inside, two people sat shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped, facing whatever the morning would bring, not as strangers thrown together by storm, but as two souls who had chosen each other in the quiet aftermath. They left before the sky had fully lightened the mules, stepping careful over the last crust of ice that clung to the trail. Elias rode ahead, rifle across his saddle, eyes sweeping the ridges for any sign of movement. Eliza followed on the second mule, Samuel strapped to her chest in a length of wool, Elias had cut and tied. Thomas walked beside her, leading Mary by the hand, the girl's small boots crunching through the softening snow. The air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth, sharp with promise and threat in equal measure. The descent took most of the day. The trail narrowed in places, forcing them single file, the drop to one side steep enough that Eliza kept her gaze fixed on Elias's broad back, rather than the void below. Twice they stopped to rest the animals. Each time Elias checked the children's hands for cold-adjusted blankets passed around strips of jerky without a word. His silence was not cold now. It was watchful, protective, the kind that said more than speech ever could. Silverton appeared in late afternoon smoke rising thin from stovepipes, the main street a churned ribbon of mud and melting snow. The town looked smaller than Eliza remembered, meaner in the flat light. Faces turned as they rode in, miners pausing mid-stride, women at doorways narrowing their eyes at the stranger family trailing the mountain man. Whispers followed like smoke. Elias tied the mules outside the assay office without flourish. The sign above the door read CROWE and SONS in faded gilt. He lifted Samuel down, handed him to Eliza, then helped Mary from the saddle. Thomas stayed close, small jaw set. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coal dust and coin. Harlan Crow stood behind a high counter ledger, open spectacles, low on his nose. He was thinner than Eliza recalled, cheeks hollowed, but the eyes were the same, sharp, acquisitive. Two men leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, badges glinting on their vests. Deputies or men paid to act the part. Crow looked up slowly. His gaze slid over Elias first, then settled on Eliza. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, voice dry as old paper. "Thought the mountains might have kept you." "They tried," she answered. She kept her chin level. "We're here about the debt." Crow closed the ledger with deliberate care. 240 plus interest. Comes to 312 now. Jacob signed clear. Laws clear. Debt don't die with the man. Elias stepped forward, boots deliberate on the plank floor. Law might say one thing. Common sense says another. Woman's got 3 children and no claim left worth a dime. You'll get blood from stone before you get 300 from her. Crow's mouth twitched. Then I'll take what's left. Cabin. Mules. Furs, if you've got any. Or we can go before the judge in Durango. He's fond of clear paper. Eliza felt the ring on her finger, the faint weight of it. She stepped beside Elias. "We've come to settle it, not run from it." Crow raised an eyebrow. "With what you look like, you've barely enough for supper." Elias reached into his coat, drew out a small leather pouch, and set it on the counter. The clink of coin was loud in the quiet room. He opened the drawstring. Double eagles, half eagles, gold, that caught the lamplight and held it. 240, Elias said. "Count it if you want. The rest we keep for the children's winter." Crow stared at the gold, then at Elias. Something flickered behind the calculation in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the sour taste of being outmaneuvered. "Where'd a trapper get that?" one of the deputies asked. "None of your concern," Elias answered, voice flat. "It's good. It's here. Debt's paid." Crow's fingers hovered over the coins. He looked at Eliza again, searching for weakness, and finding none. At last he scooped the gold into a drawer, shut it with a snap. "Paid," he said. "Clear." Eliza exhaled the breath she had held since the storm first drove them to Elias's door. Thomas's hand found hers, small fingers squeezing tight. Mary pressed against her leg. Samuel stirred in her arms, waking to the sudden stillness. Elias turned to leave. At the door, he paused, looked back. "You come looking for more," he told Crow. "You'll find me first." Crow said nothing. The deputies shifted uneasy. Outside, the street had quieted. A few onlookers lingered curious. Elias helped the children mount up again. Eliza handed Samuel to Thomas, then turned to Elias. You used your winter stake, she said quietly. Everything you'd saved. Wasn't saving it for me, he answered. She reached up, touched the side of his face the way she had that night in the cabin. This time he caught her hand, held it there a moment longer. They rode out of Silverton as the sun dropped behind the peaks, painting the snowfields rose and gold. No one followed. The trail climbed again, slower now, the mules sure-footed in the familiar dark. By the time they reached the cabin, the stars had kindled overhead, cold and brilliant. Inside, Elias built the fire, while Eliza settled the children. Mary fell asleep almost at once, cheek against Thomas's shoulder. Samuel curled in Eliza's lap, thumb in his mouth. Thomas watched the flames a long time before speaking. We staying? He asked, voice small. Elias looked at Eliza across the hearth. She met his eyes. We're staying, she said. This is home now. Later, when the children slept, Elias sat beside her on the rug. He took her hand, the one wearing his wife's ring, and threaded his fingers through hers. Tomorrow, he said, we'll speak the words. Preacher rides through next week. Or we can do it here, just us and the mountains as witness. Either way. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. The fire popped softly. Outside, a coyote yipped once, answered by the wind moving through the pines. Tomorrow, she agreed. The cabin held them close, warm against the returning cold of night. In the quiet, two lives that had begun in separate silences now breathed as one. The children slept on, dreaming perhaps of green meadows or high ridges, dreams yet to be shaped. And in the joining of hands, in the simple promise, kept the future opened like a high meadow after long winter, not easy, not without shadow, but wide and possible, and theirs. The preacher arrived 6 days later, riding a sway-backed gray mare with saddlebags stuffed full of hymnals and a dog-eared Bible. He was a small man named Reverend Hale, face weathered to the color of old saddle leather, eyes kind behind wire-rimmed spectacles that had seen better decades. Word had spread quiet like, through the high country, word of the mountain man who had taken in a widow and her 3 young ones, word of a debt, settled in gold rather than blood. Folks came, not many, but enough. A trapper and his wife from the next ridge, an old prospector who claimed the cabin had once belonged to his cousin, 2 miners who had known Elias in passing and figured a wedding was worth a day off the claims. They gathered in the small clearing beside the cabin, where the snow had melted into muddy patches and the first wild iris pushed purple spears through the grass. The sun stood high, warm, for the first time in months, turning the peaks to soft silver against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Elias had spent the morning splitting extra wood and hauling water. Now he stood scrubbed, clean beard trimmed, wearing the only clean shirt he owned, a faded blue chambray that still carried the faint scent of lye soap Eliza had boiled it in. Eliza wore her best dress, the gray wool one she had carried folded at the bottom of their bundle, all the way from Missouri. It was patched at the elbows and too thin for mountain winters. But Mary had helped her pin fresh pine sprigs along the collar, and the green smelled sharp and clean. Thomas stood beside her in boots. Elias had oiled the night before, shoulders squared like a small soldier. Mary clutched her ragdoll eyes wide with the importance of the occasion. Samuel balanced on Elias's hip, tugging at the man's collar with chubby fingers, babbling softly. Reverend Hale cleared his throat and opened the Bible. His voice carried gentle over the quiet crowd. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words were familiar, yet they landed new. Eliza heard them as though for the first time, not as ceremony, but as promise carved into the living day. When Hale asked if she took Elias to be her husband, to love and honor in sickness and in health, she looked straight into the eyes of the man who had opened his door to strangers in a blizzard, and said without hesitation, I do. Elias's voice was rougher, lower, but steady as the ridge behind them. I do. No rings were exchanged beyond the plain gold band already on her finger. Hale spoke of love, not as fire, but as the slow work of seasons of planting and waiting, of enduring frost to reach harvest. Then he pronounced them man and wife, and the small gathering clapped soft and earnest. The trapper's wife pressed a jar of wild plum jam into Eliza's hands. The prospector offered a tin whistle he claimed brought good luck. The miner shook Elias's hand, one muttering something about finally getting some sense, old man. Afterward, they ate outside on planks, laid across stumps. Elias had roasted a yearling doe he'd taken 2 days earlier, and Eliza had baked cornbread with the last of the meal and dried apples stewed with cinnamon. A peddler had traded for pelts. The children ran among the adults' laughing faces, sticky with jam. Samuel rode on the trapper's shoulders, crowing with delight. Thomas showed the prospector how to whittle a whistle of his own. As the sun dropped behind the western peaks, the guests drifted away one by one, leaving the family alone again. The clearing quieted. The fire Elias had built crackled low. Eliza sat on a log watching the children chase fireflies that had somehow appeared with the dusk. Elias settled beside her, close enough their shoulders touched. "Feels different," she said softly. "Does..." She turned the ring on her finger, feeling the worn groove where it had rested for years on another hand. I kept thinking I'd feel guilty. Wearing it. Keeping it." He looked at her eyes, reflecting the last of the firelight. "She'd have liked you. Liked the way you fight for them. The way you stayed standing when the world tried to knock you flat." Eliza swallowed. "And you, any regrets?" "Only one," he said. "That I didn't find you sooner." She leaned into him, then head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the slow rise and fall of his breath. The children, eventually tired, came to them yawning. Elias carried Samuel inside. Eliza followed with Mary and Thomas. They tucked the little ones into the bunk-kissed foreheads, murmured goodnights. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, roasted meat, pine, and the faint sweetness of plum jam. Later, when the house was still, Elias and Eliza lay together on the pallet. He had widened with extra hides. No rush, no urgency, just the quiet meeting of bodies that had both known too much loneliness. His hands were gentle, calloused, sure. Hers traced the old scars on his back, the crooked knuckle, the line beside his eye. They moved together slow, like people learning a new trail by starlight, finding the places where hurt had been, and the places where healing could begin. Afterward, they lay tangled, listening to the night sounds, an owl hunting along the ridge, the soft sigh of wind, through the pines, the even breathing of sleeping children. Elias pressed a kiss to her temple. "Tomorrow we start the garden," he murmured. "Potatoes first, then beans. Corn if the season holds." She smiled against his chest. "And a bigger smokehouse. For when the children get bigger appetites. Already planning bigger. Always." The fire had burned to embers. Outside the mountains stood sentinel, vast and indifferent, yet tonight they seemed almost kind. Eliza thought of the blizzard that had driven her to this door, of the hunger, and the cold and the fear that had once felt endless. She thought of the man beside her, of the children safe under one roof, of the small gold band that now carried 2 stories instead of 1. She closed her eyes, feeling for the first time in years the shape of tomorrow, not as threat, but as promise. In the high country, spring came slow, but it came sure. And in its coming, 4 lives that had been scattered by loss began quietly, fiercely to grow roots deep enough to weather whatever winters still waited. The trail ahead is darker, slower, and more honest. Subscribe and ride into it with us.